that, and the recording is now starting. I will first introduce Susanna Heschel, who is the Eli M. Black Distinguished Professor and Chair of the Jewish Studies Program at Dartmouth College. Her scholarship focuses on the history of Jewish and Protestant religious thought in Germany during the 19th and 20th century, and she's the author of Abraham Geiger and the Jewish Jesus, Aryan Jesus, Christian Theologians in the Bible in Nazi Germany, and Jüdische Islam, Jüdisch-Deutsche Selbstbestimmung, and a forthcoming book written with Sarah Imhoff, Jewish Studies and the Woman Question. Welcome and thank you.
Thank you so much, Piotr. Thank you for organizing this wonderful event and allowing us to have an occasion to express our gratitude to Jeffrey Herf. I want to begin by going back to my student days when I read Reactionary Modernism. It was, I believe, Jeffrey's first book, and it was for me an eye-opening book. It provided for me an excellent, provocative, and original theoretical formulation in my graduate school days when I was writing my dissertation that I brought to my study of German Protestant theology and the Wissenschaft des Judentums in the 19th century, very far afield from the topic of the book, but the formulation was so brilliant and incisive that it could be transported to a very different piece of work. And I'm grateful to this day for that work, for that book. It was a few years later that I was thrilled to meet Jeffrey Herf at a conference. He was and is a legendary figure in the academic world. He's the person who knows the archives, who also knows the historiography, and also understands how to formulate a clear and definitive argument. He's also generous to his colleagues, to his students. He's eager to hear about new research. He's eager to be helpful to those of us who turn to him for advice about our own work. My visits with Jeffrey and with his wife, Sonia Michel, at their home or at mine have been highlights, memorable conversations, and great warmth and friendship. Jeffrey Herf is one of the most important scholars of the Nazi era and of anti-Semitism, and his work has been agenda setting. Even more, his work is bold. He does not supplement the accepted line of argumentation, but courageously examines conventionally accepted claims critically and brings new archival evidence to questions and ultimately reformulates the standard conclusions. Jeffrey's scholarship, and I think now of his book, The Jewish Enemy, demonstrates the shift in Nazi propaganda with the onset of the war to a racial discourse of Jews as enemies of Germans, preparing Germans for the genocidal war of extermination that was not questioned even by those who at times found it unpleasant to carry out the gruesome murder of human beings. Nazi propaganda was effective. Germans found murder of Jews reasonable after so many decades, even centuries of anti-Semitism, and Jeffrey makes that clear. Even, in fact, the important Protestant theologian at the University of Tübingen, Gerhard Kittel, included murder of the Jews as one of several possible solutions to the so-called Jewish question in a pamphlet he published in May of 1933, and in a document I found February of 1936 at a meeting of prominent Protestant theologians held in Dresden. No one raised an eyebrow when one of them, Siegfried Loeffler, said that he knew that murder was a violation of the Ten Commandments, but when he took a gun to the Jews, he would simply say the word Christ. Furthermore, Jeffrey demonstrates just as Jews were the enemy, so the United States was identified as Jewish in Nazi propaganda. That is, Germany was fighting what they claimed was a defensive war against both Jews and Americans, and he demonstrates that. There are, in fact, too many historians for whom anti-Semitism is irrelevant to the study of the Third Reich, who ignore the Holocaust even when examining the Second World War, who think anti-Semitism may be unpleasant, but is not a motivation in the murder of 6 million Jews. Functionalists were appealing at a time. They claimed that, Jews were killed perhaps because there just wasn't enough food around to feed them. Or Nazis murdered Jews because, they were just simply obeying orders. So they were authoritarian personalities under group pressure, or fearful of getting killed themselves if they refused, all myths that persist to this day. Jeffrey's crucially important work is to undermine those myths once and for all because they are historically wrong, and he proves it. Indeed, it may have been difficult for some scholars in the past to believe that anti-Semitism, which they thought of as an irrational hatred or something medieval that somehow erupts in the modern world in a bizarre way, completely inappropriate way of thinking. It may have been difficult for them to think of anti-Semitism as so powerful. But of course, the rise of anti-Semitism in recent years has, or at least must, bring a sea change in our thinking. To some scholars, it's only material gain, money, sex, that's understandable, and anti-Semitism seems too strange to be a motivation. In fact, I would argue that their avoidance of Jeffrey's conclusions is evidence that a low level of anti-Semitism has been so successfully disseminated and internalized that those scholars don't even recognize its power. They would not deny, for example, that racism plays a role in the murder of Black Americans by police, yet they seem confused that anti-Semitism motivated the Holocaust. Thus, Jeffrey writes in his book, The Jewish Enemy, Nazi propaganda was so effective that, quote, as a result, an anti-Semitic consensus had become widespread in German and Austrian society. Consensus. Jeffrey's scholarship is vast, and I just want to mention a few additional studies. In his recent book, Israel's Moment, he demonstrates a fascinating and important shift in our political alignments. The book opens with a dramatic moment when Israel was established, when its liberal and leftist supporters understood Zionism as an anti-imperialist and anti-racist movement. Yes, of course, the Soviet Union wanted to weaken Britain, but went further, with Czechoslovakia supplying arms and training to Israel when the United States refused, weapons that were crucial in winning Israel's war of independence. So what has changed? It's not Zionism, but our categories of analysis, what we choose to define as liberalism and anti-racism. Let us recall that the DEI programs and anti-racism efforts do not include anti-Semitism, a political decision at most universities that is deeply disturbing, if not outrageous. The appreciation Jeffrey extends to his teacher and mentor, George Mosse, is also admirable. And I remember when I first met Jeffrey for the first time, he spoke so warmly of Mosse and his influence. He pays tribute in an article to Mosse's studies of anti-Semitism, to the important and sophisticated ways in which Mosse analyzed German anti-Semitism, on the history of European racism and anti-Semitism in the 19th and 20th centuries, in which Mosse demonstrates the commonalities and differences between European white racism of the modern era toward Blacks and European racial hatred of Jews. Anti-Semitism is hatred of the Jewish body. It is not simply a matter of colorism, and thus demands a more sophisticated analysis by contemporary anti-racists than they have as yet developed. In Jeffrey's book, Nazi Propaganda for the Arab World, he further demonstrates the spread of Nazi propaganda to Arabs in Arabic, an Arabic language that sought to promote hatred of the United States and Britain and revulsion at Jews, who were described as the arch enemies of Muslims. The corpus of Jeffrey's work comprises a thoughtful analysis of how anti-Semitism migrates from one region to another, from one context to another, from one political ideology to another. Jeffrey examines right-wing, left-wing, and Islamist anti-Semitic discourse and demonstrates the connections among them. For example, few scholars of anti-Semitism have incorporated attention to Islamism's anti-Semitism in their studies of European and American anti-Semitism. Jeffrey does so brilliantly, demonstrating the links between the post-war European so-called left and the terrorist propaganda of the anti-Israel radicals within the Islamic world. The shocking rise of radical anti-Semitism in the German left after 1967, which countenanced murder of Jews, as he demonstrates, and carried it out in their terrorist attacks, that was stimulated, he shows, by their links with Islamist propaganda. Finally, throughout, let me say, Jeffrey's work is impeccably accurate, rooted in new and fascinating archival data that he has uncovered. His work is argued carefully. It's written in clear and engaging style. He does not simplify, he complicates. Indeed, he presents the complexity of each problem he analyzes. He sets a high model of scholarly engagement in central issues. He reorients our thinking, recontextualizes our data, and gives us, ultimately, the greatest gift, a far more complex depiction that does not try to shirk ethical questions and responsibilities. I thank you, Jeffrey, for your work very much. I thank you also for Piotr and for all of you for gathering for this opportunity to express our gratitude to Jeffrey as a colleague, as a friend, as a great scholar whose work will have important influence for generations to come. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Susanna. Jeffrey, since Susanna unfortunately has to leave early, would you like to say a few words, engage with her remarks?
Well, certainly, of course, can you hear me? And technically we're okay. Well, thank you very, very much. I'm looking at the people who are listening in, and the most wonderful thing or rather, it is very wonderful for historians to be understood by our colleagues and our peers. And we all hope that our work will reach a broad audience, but we are realists, and we understand that when we write the way we do, it could be a relatively small audience that really gets it. And Susanna's comments perfectly understand what I was trying to do in The Jewish Enemy and in Nazi Propaganda for the Arab World and Israel's Moment. So I want to thank you because the the Temptations' famous song is "Smiling Faces Don't Tell the Truth," and all of you know that when you really have a friend and a colleague, as opposed to a smiling face that doesn't tell the truth, that's the colleague that actually reads what you've published and really pays attention to it, and criticizes it or agrees with it or engages with it. And so that's exactly what Susanna has done. I want to add one thing, and that is that Susanna Heschel's own scholarship has been important for me, and I'm sure for many other people, because Susanna is among those historians who remind us of the obvious. And reminding of the obvious is something that is extremely important. And the obvious, of course, is that anti-Semitism exists in part because Christianity existed. And there is a Christianity which is philo-Semitic. There is a Christianity which inspired the resistance against Nazism. There is a very decent and wonderful Christianity, and we all know that. But there also is a Christianity that until 1965 in the Catholic Church blamed the Jews for the death of Jesus. And the Holocaust was not the direct result of Christianity, but it's inconceivable without those 19th centuries as well. And Susanna's work on the radicalization of Christianity in the Nazi era is really indispensable. And I learned an enormous amount from reading about those horrible, quote, professors who came up with the idea of an Aryan Jesus. And I think sometimes I think the most radical book that I've assigned my students in courses is Freud's Future of an Illusion. And because it's easy to talk about capitalism and imperialism and racism. I mean, it's not easy, but it's, I think you know what I mean. But to actually suggest that there might be some connection between religion and murder is something that really upsets our students, no matter how hip they think they are. And Susanna is one of those scholars who has a deep understanding of religion, its power for good and for not so good. So I want to thank you for your comments. You really understand what I've been doing, and thank you for our friendship over these many, many decades, which will continue, to be sure. And Sonia also sends her warm regards, and we look forward to seeing you in Silver Spring or seeing you in Boston. We'll be doing this for a long time. I'm not retiring as a historian, and so we'll be having these conversations for quite a while. And also, the fact that our books exist is important, and those books will resonate, I hope, for quite some time. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. We're going to move slightly backward in time. We're going to resume the order of operations in the order of Jeffrey's publications now. And I'm privileged to introduce now Richard Wolin. Professor Wolin teaches history, political science, and comparative literature at the CUNY Graduate Center. His most recent book is Heidegger in Ruins: Between Philosophy and Ideology, published by Yale University Press in 2023. Richard, you have the floor.
And reviewed by Jeff Herf in Quillette in February, within weeks of its publication. I spent a long time writing that book. I commiserated during the pandemic lockdown via phone with Jeff on numerous occasions, which helped keep me afloat. At one point, I figured I was in a cabin in the Catskills, and I had this irrational fear that the Unabomber was my doppelganger or something like that. Quite irrational. But talk about collegiality. I know for a fact that Jeff had his own work to take care of and better things to do than to read a 500-page book on Heidegger, which originally was 600 pages. So it could have been worse, but he saw to it that the book was promptly reviewed, and this really set the tone for the reception of the book. In addition to this wigged out, if I may use the expression, tweet by Joyce Carol Oates, retweet, right, of actually Stephen Ashheim's review. So I've always thought of Jeff as an important compagnon de route, and that we've not always in close geographical proximity, but certainly as colleagues and out of intellectual solidarity, we've been marching shoulder to shoulder and fighting a number of uphill battles. And I'm supposed to speak on reactionary modernism, which I will in a minute. But it's Jeff is really, as Susanna Heschel indicated, and as I'm sure has been said previously in these sessions, Jeff had to fight an uphill battle, and I'm not sure what's going on. Okay. And his perseverance is quite impressive. I won't go into the individual instances of adversity, that he's had to overcome through no fault of his own. It doesn't reflect well on American academia nor the American left. But not only has he fought through a considerable measure of adversity and outright hostility, but as I'm sure as Susanna mentioned, etc., Jeff's output, certainly not quantitative, but having published so many important books that have gotten so much attention and that are indispensable rites of passage for pursuing German history, of course, European history, Jewish history. Jeff's work as a whole is an absolute is absolutely indispensable and necessary, and I go back to it frequently and benefit from it, as I did recently, working through the conservative revolution yet again for this recent book on Heidegger, and once again Jeff's first book, which I've meant to mention right at the outset. I mean, it's an incredible piece of work. It's so thoroughly researched, and Jeff had the wisdom to keep it very focused. And as a result of having done that with these relatively succinct chapters on the so-called stars of the conservative revolution, Junge and Schmidt and Hans Freie, Spengler as a precursor, and others. Jeff made this book absolutely indispensable to an international public. That, of course, there was a hiatus in the reception of the conservative revolutionaries after World War II, and then, of course, there's been a significant comeback of late, which no one can ignore in terms of the, whatever one wants to call it, the new right. In Germany, it's the Neue Rechte, Institut für Staatspolitik, etc. In France, the Nouvelle Droite. Already in the 60s, there's a meeting between Armin Moller, the former Schmidt secretary, and Alain de Benoit, and the whole program for the reformulation and recreation of whatever one wants to call it, neo-fascism in some form, for want of a better term, has been to rehabilitate the far right or interwar fascism via reception of the conservative revolution. This is what Alexander Dugin says verbatim when he's appointed to this Institute for Sociology at Moscow State University, and concerned with Schmidt and Haushofer, etc. And I must admit, one of the eeriest moments of, I have a chapter of this Heidegger book called From Beyond the Grave. It's the penultimate chapter, Heidegger and the New Right. And one of the eeriest moments of working on the problem of the Heidegger reception concerned Anders Behring Breivik's manifesto in 2011, right before he committed this unspeakably heinous deed in Oslo and Utøya, Norway. To cut to the chase, at several points, Breivik says what Europe needs today is a conservative revolution. And it's not an accident that he picked up on this term. It's also, he writes a letter a year after he's arrested to imprisoned NSU, Nationalsozialistischer Untergrund member, where he says, we're fighting the same battle, we're fighting for a conservative revolution in Europe. And Jeff's work, I believe, this is a rough count, this first book has been translated into 13 languages. I think only 4 years ago into French, which there are very few people, no one I can think of, whose first book has been translated into so many languages and has been such a absolute point of reference. And I don't want to overlook the Einzigartigkeit, here I am in Berlin, of this book, its distinctiveness, because as Susanna Heschel alluded to a few minutes ago, at the time, in the early 80s, historians were, of course, still predominantly wedded to functionalist explanations of the Holocaust. And part of the thrust of this historiographical démarche was, well, to underplay ideology, of course, and to present Nazism, not at all incorrectly, as a modern phenomenon, as an outgrowth of modernity. But that's not all it was, of course. And Jeff's book intervened at a crucial moment in this debate. And of course, reception histories are always the question of momentum, time, der Augenblick, timing. So it took a while to hit home, but what Jeff showed was that this entweder oder, or either or, of Nazism as some past-directed romantic utopia, on the one hand, a return to the Middle Ages, which of course is a very superficial and partial view of what this movement was about, given its incredible complexities, nor the functionalist school with the emphasis on the progressive radicalization of destruction, which has no of the annihilation process, which has no responsible agents. It's close to a fog of war explanation, no one's fault, and hence, like the phrase that's been hovering in the room that I think Susanna Heschel also alluded to is remarkably, one has a Holocaust without anti-Semitism. This is quite an achievement, essentially. And what Jeff was able to show was that one does not need to side with either of these extremes, and that there is room for the importance of ideology, not in a way that's self-subsistent or tells the whole story, but one can't explain the nature of National Socialism's this kind of negative utopia or these dystopian goals without at some level alluding not only to ideology, but some partial version of Deutsche Sonderweg. Only meaning, of course, every nation has a Sonderweg. We kind of know that, okay? But in this case, one can look back. There's nothing that's pre-fated or predetermined, but one can look back and reconstruct certain tendencies that do horrifically come to fruition and come together in 1933, and there are preludes and very important ideological preludes, and of course everything is terrifically radicalized from the margins to the center on the part of the conservative after World War I, for reasons that aren't very hard to explain. And Jeff, at a stage in not only English language but many other languages, where the conservative revolutionaries weren't well translated. It's a different situation now. Yeah. But there were a couple of younger novels that were translated, I mean, Fryer has, I think, still one book translated into English, etc. you know, the Welle or wave Schmidt translations didn't kick in until the late 1980s, really, in English. But you know, Jeff systematically went through this material, established the connections, and really put this problem of the conservative revolutionary, whatever you want to call it, worldview. Of course, there's some who deny that it's a thing, but put it on the map for our consideration. And I think it really enhanced our sense of the breadth and extent and importance of the ideological background, especially given the attractiveness, quote unquote, of these writers like Junge, Schmidt, etc., to the Bildungsbürgertum and the German middle classes in accustoming a wider swath of the population to these radical, authoritarian, and often folkish ideas. I mean, I'm not going to go on this because I have a long chapter. It's kind of a pleonasm. They're all long, unfortunately. But on the question of Junge and Heidegger and Der Arbeiter. And, you know, there's an incredible discourse on part of the German right. One could say that it began with Spengler in 1919 and Preußentum und Sozialismus, trying to win the working class over to the cause of German nationalism. This is a obsession with the German right, and one can see it in so many. Jeff also, you know, took the time and patience to go through Junger's journalism in the 1920s, which was left out of their two editions of Junger's Gesammelte Schriften, one from 1980 with, I think, Bouvier, which had left out the political journalism from the 1920s. If you want to understand where Junge went from the war diaries, you know, to Totale Mobilmachung and Der Arbeiter, these which still haven't been translated into English, of course. They came out in about 2003 or something like that. But Jeff went through them and he made the connections and he made this available. I could go on for each of these thinkers. You know, I won't. But I mean, but he got Heidegger exactly right, which was amazing, insofar as, of course, the Heidegger became, you know, salonfähig again after the war through his technology critique. This incredible topicality and actuality. You know, he's received by the Greens in the 80s, etc. Well, that really isn't the whole story if one looks at his technique, Begeisterung, or enthusiasm, under Junger's influence in the early 1930s. And, you know, there are all these essays, some of which actually I've just translated, were into English before, on the concept of the Arbeiter, der Student als Arbeiter. And this is, you know, it's such an important avenue for the German right reconstructing itself after November 1918 and the you know, November Revolution to try to win over the working class. That's basically, you know, there's so much one can say about the book, but, you know, just biographically, having read the book when it came out, having taught the book on numerous occasions, I found myself going back to it in ways that were absolutely indispensable for my ability to reconstruct the intellectual background and context for Heidegger's signing on to the National Revolution in 1933. Not just signing on, but trying, as Otto Bögler once said, den Führer zu führen, to lead the leader. So, you know, I have much to thank Jeff for personally, and Sonia, intellectually, spiritually, and I'm very appreciative that Piotr was kind enough to invite me to participate today. And, you know, I can't think of a more deserving scholar for an event of this nature. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Richard. Jeffrey, I have a question for you. Would you
Okay.
prefer to, would you prefer to respond briefly, let's say 5 minutes each after each speaker, the way you did with Susanna, or would you rather hold your response until the other two speakers have spoken?
Actually, I'd like to say something now, and then after the
Go
other
for it.
speaker, and then
Yes.
the other people who are waiting could say something. Well, first of all, Richard, yes, we are. You are my compagnon de route as well, and for many decades. Richard talked about adversity and by persistence and all that. I think that some of the people who are listening on this Zoom call know that Richard Wolin is a scholar of great courage as well, and that that we are among those historians of Germany who worked on the anti-democratic right in the 1920s and then on the Nazis. And we noticed, you couldn't avoid it, that they despised the French Enlightenment. They thought reason was a horrible thing. And that emotions and souls and passions and will, that's where it was at. And much too much intellectualism, which of course was associated with the Jews. And then to our surprise, in the 1980s and 1990s, there were our colleagues in American history departments, and especially English departments, who thought that reason was a terrible thing and emotions were great, and that rationality had to do with domination and control and nothing to do with autonomy and freedom. And the postmodernist years were, there were various critics, of course, but Richard Wolin is, among us intellectual historians or historians, he is the guy who went out on a limb when it wasn't quite so popular, and he took on the postmodernists, and he wrote a number of books in which he reminded people that, in Germany, these ideas were associated with Nazism and fascism. So why are you so enthusiastic about it? And his scholarship too was impeccable, and he it made a difference. I'm sure it made a big difference. What Richard's new book is. I continue to be astonished, pleasantly surprised at the success of reactionary modernism. But Richard's Richard, what's it? Heidegger's what? Heidegger's downfall? No,
Heidegger in Ruins.
Heidegger in Ruins. Yes, Heidegger in Ruins is a book that's going to be around for a long, long time. And it's a really important book. And it's written with that sense of urgency that I have when I wrote Reactionary Modernism, and then that fascism is not in the past. That it's a danger, and that there are people who have university degrees who articulate these ideas and think that they're very clever. I'm very grateful to Richard for his comments about reactionary modernism. I'm very indebted to Thomas Mann and his novel Dr. Faustus, which is really the origins of the idea of reactionary modernism, of the old new world of revolutionary reaction, and Mann got it. But sort of in their own way, Max Horkheimer and Theodor Adorno did, and not as clearly as Mann, but they got a lot of it. And the notion of a Holocaust without anti-Semitism was there in the air. That certainly was part of the scene in the 60s and the 70s. So one would like to think that the ideas of the conservative revolution were comfortably consigned to the past, but Richard is right, and I hope you all will read Heidegger in Ruins. The whole book is splendid. He's giving you just some tidbits of the chapters on the chapter on the new right in recent decades, but it's an important book in as a work of scholarship, of historical scholarship, and it is a political intervention in defense of democracy and liberalism too. So we are companions along the same road, and thank you so very much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jeffrey. I will ask now as the next speaker, Matthias Künzel. Just pin him to the screen. Matthias Künzel is a political scientist living near Hamburg, Germany. He was published with Telos Press in 2007, book entitled Jihad and Jew Hatred, Islamism, Nazism, and the Roots of 9/11, and Germany and Iran, from the Aryan Axis to the Nuclear Threshold in 2014. His new book is entitled Nazis, Islamic Anti-Semitism, and the Middle East, the 1948 Arab War against Israel and the aftershocks of World War II, forthcoming this summer with Routledge. Welcome.
Hello, Jeffrey.
Hello, Matthias.
Dear friends, I'm very proud that I may present one of Jeffrey's most important books. But let me please make a private comment before I talk about the book Nazi Propaganda for the Arab World. First of all, what connects me and Jeffrey is the important fact that we were both born on April 24. That can't be a coincidence, I would say. But perhaps even more important is the fact that we reacted very similarly to the catastrophe of 9/11 without ever having met before. We were both convinced that the worldview of the perpetrators, including their religious radicalism, had to be taken seriously. And we both came to the conclusion, independently of each other, that the 9/11 attackers with their anti-Semitic conspiracy theories were more reminiscent of the legacies of Nazism than of those of the anti-imperialist left. Herf first presented this assessment on October 8, 2001, at a faculty student forum in College Park. He shattered two taboos of the academic world at the time. First, he openly named the Islamists anti-Semitism instead of glossing it over as anti-Zionism. Second, he did not shy away from alluding to the obvious points of contact between this anti-Semitism and that of the Nazis. Till today, he has the courage to raise his voice loudly against the concentrated leftist mainstream. Academic anti-Zionism and the resulting BDS campaigns he wrote recently in Tablet magazine have aligned the Western left with the afterlife of Hitler's Nazi party and its larger designs for the Middle East. Here he was commenting on the present from the perspective of an historian with an entire century in mind. Already in his great book of 2006, The Jewish Enemy, he quotes anti-Semitic tirades of Hajj Amin al-Husseini, the Mufti of Jerusalem, and describes the, quote, historically significant meeting of minds between Nazism and radical fundamentalist Islam, end quote. And he added, examination of the impact of Nazism on the Arab and Muslim world is still in its early stages. But then in the summer of 2007, he discovered in the United States National Archives at College Park several thousand pages of verbatim English transcripts of Nazi Germany's Arabic language radio broadcasts to the Middle East. Most of them were compiled under the direction of United States Ambassador Alexander Kirk in the American Embassy in Cairo. The Nazi broadcast their Arabic language propaganda programs from April 1939 to April 1945, 6 years long. They wanted to spread their hatred of the Jews in the Middle East, to defeat Zionism, and with the active help of the Arabs, to exterminate the 700,000 Jews in the Middle East, thus extending the Holocaust to this region. Herf's discovery was of highest importance. It comprises the most complete record anywhere in any language of Nazi Germany's efforts to influence the Arab and Islamic world via its most important propaganda program, the shortwave radio broadcasts. These transcripts offer unprecedented documentation of the merging of National Socialists with radical Islamist anti-Semitism and its diffusion in the Middle East. Through declassified already in 1977, they remained unknown and unexamined for decades. But then Jeffrey Herf came along and jumped at the source. Reading these Nazi transcripts is repulsive and often boring because of countless repetitions. I know this because Jeffrey kindly provided me with much of these documents for my most recent book. Herf, however, was not deterred by this, but read and analyzed the entire volume in a disciplined manner. In 2009, he summarized the results of his research in his landmark book, Nazi Propaganda for the Arab World. Anyone who reads this book, writes aptly my colleague Martin Kloke, not only gets a new view of rather unknown arena of Nazi history, but also of the peculiarities of the history of the Arab and Jewish Middle East, end quote. Herf's book consists of 8 chronologically arranged chapters. After an introduction, the second chapter examines the Nazis' attempts to reconcile their racist contempt for Arabs with an active anti-Semitic Arab policy. The 5 chapters that follow document and analyze the content of Nazi radio propaganda in Arabic chronologically and against the backdrop of wartime developments. Herf treats in particular detail the Nazi propaganda during the battles in North Africa in 1942, in which the Nazis openly called for pogroms. Herf's book thus restored Nazi Germany's propaganda efforts from its previous role as a footnote in Nazi history to its actual historical role at the center of Nazi ambitions for Muslim lands. It describes the synthesis of Nazism, Arab nationalism, and fundamentalist Islam, and goes into detail about the role Islam played in the context of Nazi anti-Semitic propaganda. The Quran and its selective appropriation and interpretation was the most important text for Nazism's point of cultural entry to Arabs and Muslims. Every news report would begin with a recitation of verses from the Quran. Herf shows that just as Nazi anti-Semitism was inseparably from the radicalization of already existing elements within Europe's Christian culture, so the anti-Semitism of the pro-Nazi Arab exiles was inseparably from the radicalization of already existing elements within the traditions of Islam. He speaks of the cultural fusion of European with Islamic traditions of Jew hatred. To this day, this fusion, which combines the most negative images of Jews from the early days of Islam with the phantasms of European anti-Semitism, is virulent in the Muslim world. Another issue in Nazi radio propaganda that remains acute today was the struggle against fellow Arabs who entertained the possibility of coexistence with Jews in Palestine. Herf quotes from a 1943 radio broadcast, I quote, "Fellow Arabs, you should maintain your policy of boycotting the Jews. You should punish those who ignore the boycott. All Arabs who collaborate with the Jews should be destroyed before they help the Jews destroy us," end quote. Herf also discusses British and American intelligence on the impact of Arabic language radio propaganda from Berlin. He shows that the Allies deliberately refrained from countering Nazi hatred of the Jews so as not to give new fuel to the Nazi message that they were in cahoot with the Jews. Chapter 8, which documents the post-war after effects of Arabic language Nazi propaganda, deserves special attention. Herf describes how the center of anti-Semitism shifted after 1945 to the Arab world, where the Muslim Brotherhood now sets the tone. For Amin al-Husseini and other Nazi collaborators, I quote, the 1948 war against the formation of a Jewish state in Palestine was a continuation of their activities and beliefs during World War II. That the Mufti, as a particular active helper in the Holocaust, was allowed to continue pursuing his anti-Semitic visions from 1946 onward, sparked strong protests from anti-fascists in the United States and elsewhere. Herf wrote about this in his most recent book, Israel's Moment. We live today in a time when many declare the reality of the Holocaust to be an invention and the invented protocols of the elders of Zion to be reality. Against this background, Herf's work assumes significance that points beyond its actual historical subject. First, Herf takes seriously the anti-Semitic material found in the transcripts of the radio broadcasts and documents it in excruciating detail. The fact that the author does not avoid this disturbing reality makes this book a significant document. Second, it addresses the question of the origins of anti-Semitism in the Middle East. To this day, the dominant thesis in academia is that anti-Semitism in the Arab Islamic world is to be understood as a direct response to the policies of the Zionists and Israel, and therefore must be judged quite differently than European anti-Semitism. I believe that it is due to this misconception that Western Middle East policy to this day refuses to decisively combat the Jewish hatred of, for example, Hezbollah and Hamas. Herf's study refutes the claim that Jew hatred in the Middle East is fundamentally different from European anti-Semitism. He writes in the preface of his book, I quote, traces of the melange of Nazi ideology, radical Arab nationalism and fundamentalist Islam that emerged in wartime Berlin did persist in the Middle East. Third, Herf's study is also particularly important in the context of the Abraham Accords. The peace agreement of September 2020 marked the first paradigm shift in 75 years, in the context of which an Arab reprisal of Middle East history under the slogan, "What went wrong?" seems possible. Is the assessment of Ali Mahir, former Prime Minister of Egypt, that Arab resistance to Zionists was, I quote, the product of Nazi propaganda in the Arab East, correct? Is there a connection between the Nazi war of extermination against the Jews, which ended in 1945, and the Arab war of extermination against Israel, which began in 1948? Questions upon questions. One thing is certain. With the publication of Nazi propaganda for the Arab world, whitewashing or making excuses for Arab collaboration with the Nazis became much more difficult. In Jeffrey Herf's work, both come together, the historian's broad view of history and diligent archival work, that means work on the details. He does not only work with care and accuracy, but pose at the same time issues that are morally significant and intellectually interesting. Dear Jeffrey, you are without doubt in the ranks of other heroes of the Historians Guild, such as Walter Laqueur, Bernard Louis, Saul Friedländer, Karl Bracher, or George Mosse. I wish us many more years of friendship and cooperation, and of course, Rosie and I hope that you will visit us again together with Sonia. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Matthias. Again, I would repeat what I said in response to Richard's comments, that that it is enormously gratifying when my peers understand what I've written and find it to be so important. I want people who are listening to the call. Many of you know who Matthias Kunzel is, perhaps not, but he is. I suppose he's Germany's Paul Berman. I mean, that's one way of putting it. He is really one of the most significant writers and intellectuals in the liberal tradition in the past several decades, and there's something very distinctive about Matthias Kunzel's work, and I could mention other authors of a slightly younger generation, Stefan Grijat or Lars Rensmann, but Matthias Kunzel is really the leading liberal voice in Germany, and I see that Richard Herzinger is on the call as well, and he too deserves mention for his brilliant journalism and courage and advocating the liberal tradition. But in American scholarship and American intellectual life, the kind of arguments that Matthias just made are arguments that I've made, but they don't fit into the New York Review of Books or the New Republic or the New York Times or the Washington Post. They're not heard often in the American liberal public sphere, which is a shame, because they are in their essence a part of the tradition of liberalism. And Matthias Kunzel's extensive essays and books in German and I came to Matthias's, he came to my attention, as he indicated, after 9/11, because of the book that he wrote around the same time that Paul Berman wrote Terror and Liberalism. Matthias wrote Jihad and Jew Hatred, 9/11 Nazism, and 9/11 Nazism and the origins of, what was it? Jihad and Jew Hatred, Nazism, Islamism, and the origins of 9/11. I think it was something like that.
Okay.
Yeah. And I read this book, and I said, "My goodness, I have another. I have a soul brother in Germany regarding these issues." And so we got in touch, and we've become very, very close friends. And your brilliance and courage has been an inspiration to me as well. And so I would urge people on this call to, if you have not done so, probably most of you have, but if you haven't, Matthias is a wonderful writer of Deutsch, and the English translations are well done. And his forthcoming book is a bold book that goes beyond Nazi propaganda for the Arab world. It builds on it, but it speaks of an anti-Jewish war that Haj Amin al-Husseini began to wage in 1937, and he continued to wage it until 1947-48, and he was not alone. So that book itself is an important historical intervention, and I wanted to draw it to your attention. Yeah, I think I could go on and on, but I think that's sufficient. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Jeffrey. Thank you very much, Matthias. I will now pass the floor to our final guest speaker, Professor Norman J.W. Goda. Is the Norman and Irma Bremen Professor of Holocaust Studies at the University of Florida. He has written, co-written, or edited 9 books on Nazi Germany, the Holocaust, and post-war justice. He was the lead editor on 2 books concerning Israel's origins, both comprising the diaries and papers of James G. MacDonald, who served on the Anglo-American Committee for Palestine in 1946, and as the first U.S. ambassador to Israel from 1948 to 1951. Welcome, Norm. Thank you.
Thank you, Piotr, so much for having me. It's an honor to be on such a distinguished panel, and I've known Jeff since 1996. We were colleagues together for 4 wonderful years at Ohio University, and we followed each other's work ever since. Mostly me following his work. I was very fortunate to be part of the panels yesterday, and so I'm very happy to have a second bite at the apple. It's fallen to me to discuss Jeffrey's most recent book, not his final book by any means, but his most recent book, Israel's Moment, International Support for and Opposition to Establishing the Jewish State, 1945 to 1949. Israel today is not a beloved state, as everyone here knows. And according to today's presentist discourse from various quarters, Israel is a settler colonial society based on the nationalist and expansionist ideology of Zionism, whose foundations were backed by Anglo-American imperialism. As the rest of the colonized world was throwing off its European shackles, Israel, according to this argument, was allowed to move in an anti-liberationist and even racist direction, partly owing to European guilt concerning the Holocaust. The state was illegitimate from its foundations and was seen as such from the start by right-thinking persons. It may sound as though I am drawing a caricature of an argument here, but I don't think so. I've simply read it too many times and heard it too many times in US universities, and even today, a resolution condemning Israel as an apartheid state was debated in the French National Assembly. Rejected, but debated nonetheless. So Jeffrey's book, Israel's Moment, challenges this argument. And as he writes in this month's journal Sapir for the special issue commemorating Israel's 75th anniversary, Israel, Jeffrey says, is anti-racist, anti-colonialist, and anti-fascist, and was from the start. A main premise of this book, with which I agree, is that the history of Israel's foundations, despite some very fine books by Michael Cohen, Benny Morris, and others, is not very well understood, partly owing to the complexity of the period, which includes numerous international commissions and a very complicated war in 1948, which involved fighting before the war, then multiple fronts, multiple truces, multiple UN resolutions, and the increasingly difficult issue of refugees, both Jewish and Arab. But another premise from which the book proceeds is that historians must understand Israel's formation not as something that was freestanding alone in space, but within the context of the Holocaust that preceded it and the Cold War, which hardened in the very years in which Israel was formed. Jeff was always the right scholar, in my view, to take this on, owing to his expertise in the surrounding fields of Holocaust memory, Nazi anti-Semitism, and how it affected the Arab world and the East Bloc's undeclared wars with Israel after 1967. The revelations in this book are many, but I will focus on a couple, trying along the way to show how these revelations are very much in keeping with Jeff's scholarship and also his moral compass. One concerns the place of the Holocaust in communist discourse. Jeffrey shows in this book, through reading UN records, which many historians do not read, that the Soviet bloc and the French Communist Party also emphasized the Jewish catastrophe in Europe in their advocacy for Jewish immigration to Palestine after the war, the 1947 UN partition resolution, and in subsequent debates concerning Israel. And indeed, they emphasize the Holocaust in greater detail in UN debates and elsewhere. Now, Holocaust memory scholars who examine post-war communism in Europe are used to seeing de-emphasis of the Holocaust in lieu of class-based anti-fascist narratives that center on Nazism as capitalist exploitation. Thus, the Soviets, for example, in 1944 prohibited a memorial at Babi Yar owing to the Jewish chauvinism that they thought it represented. And by 1948, Stalin had destroyed the Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee, which during the war had tried to alert the world to the Holocaust in the Soviet Union. So to see a very different public discourse about the Holocaust and Zionism during UN debates from the communist world is both new and striking. Jeff quotes Andrei Gromyko, at the time the Soviet representative to the Security Council, speaking to the UN General Assembly, and I'll quote, "The Jews," Gromyko said, "were subject to almost complete annihilation. No Western European state was able to provide adequate assistance to the Jewish people in defending its rights and in its very existence from the violence of the Hitlerites. This," Gromyko said, "explains the aspiration of the Jews to establish their own state," unquote, which Gromyko supported by partition if necessary. Now, Jeff's too good a historian to take statements like these at face value. There was a lot wrong with Gromyko's statement and from other statements from communist representatives, not least of which was the fact that the Soviets provided no aid to the Jews either. And of course, the Soviets were interested in weakening the British Empire on their southern flank. Still, one cannot overlook the fact that it was the anti-fascist, anti-colonialist communists and not the other members of the Grand Alliance that defeated Hitler, who brought Holocaust discourse into the Palestine debate. They understood and invoked the Holocaust when they wanted to, and they understood how it fit with Zionist aspirations after World War II. Ideology, in other words, had not completely blinded the communist world to the facts, at least not in the years right after the war. It was also the anti-fascist, anti-colonialist communists who rejected the stark rejectionism of the Arab states in the UN. For they, as the Arabs refused to do, saw Zionism as a legitimate anti-colonial movement. A second point to make here that Jeff points out is that American official discourse concerning Jewish self-determination took precisely the opposite tack. We are used to a narrative whereby President Harry Truman, based on the bleak report by refugee expert Earl Harrison on displaced persons camps in Europe, supported Jewish emigration to Palestine in 1946, supported the partition resolution in 1947, and ultimately recognized Israel in 1948. But as Jeff points out, it was a lot harder than it looked. And I don't know of an account that contextualizes Truman's decisions better than Israel's moment does. Jeff looks at the State Department, but also the Pentagon and the intelligence agencies, including Cold War strategic thinkers such as George Kennan. There are a couple of things to point out. One was that American agencies viewed US strategic aims as best served by preserving Britain's imperial position in the Middle East, which in turn meant continued access to critical bases and continued access to petroleum supplies. This meant supporting, along with the British, the Arab rejection of Jewish immigration, to say nothing of a Jewish state. It also meant completely ignoring that the Holocaust had just happened. Having paid no mind to the final solution as it was occurring, US agencies and British agencies too felt no special need to pay mind to the Holocaust afterwards. The murder of the European Jews was thus separated from Zionist aspirations and refugee needs precisely as it is done today by Israel's opponents. But in backing British state actors against East European Zionists, US diplomats and planners also deployed anti-Semitic tropes concerning Jews and communism, and they depended on Cold War anxieties concerning Jewish immigration to Palestine as a stalking horse for Soviet influence in the Middle East. There were, of course, Jewish communists, and the Soviets did put some agents into the Bericha groups of refugees moving west. But the anxieties were, and this was apparent at the time, overblown. And these overblown assessments had consequences. They led to a complete US miscalculation of the determination of Jewish refugees to get to Palestine, the Jewish agency's determination to develop a state, Israeli determination to fight attacking armies once that state was declared, and the Israeli refusal to consider UN policies pushed by the British and for a time by the US aimed at diminishing Israeli security, such as the Bernadotte Plan, among other things. And yet this miscalculation was not inevitable. Jeff, as he does in Divided Memory, and I discussed this yesterday, Jeff brings in the opposing voices. He discusses powerful alternative assessments by informed legislators such as Senator Robert Wagner and Congressman Emanuel Seller, and liberal writers such as I.F. Stone, Frieda Kirchwey, and many others at magazines such as PM, The New Republic, and The Nation. They argued that emancipation had failed the Jews and that Zionist aims were in fact anti-imperial, politically progressive, and entirely in the US interest. Current Arab leaders, they said, were not friends of US policies. As Stone put it, the British were using anti-Zionism as a ploy to preserve their influence in the Arab world. And Kirchwey noted, and Jeff quotes her here, human life has been subordinated to imperial policy, unquote. Kirchwey noted, but so did Seller, that a Jewish state would be a break against Soviet influence in the region. And so Jeff thus shows that Truman's desire to support Jewish immigration in 1946 and his determination to establish recognition of the new state should be seen in much sharper relief, whereby the imagined roles of the US-led and Soviet-led blocs are strangely reversed. In the meantime, he shows that the memory of the recent past, or the lack of memory of the recent past, had and has geopolitical consequences. And finally, I want to return briefly to what Susanna has referred to already and what Matthias has referred to already, this strange place of the Grand Mufti Haj Amin al-Husseini. Jeff's premise here, and it's a fascinating one, is that the British, the Americans, and the French missed a critical opportunity to shift discourse in the Arab world by exposing the Mufti's close collaboration with the Nazis and exposing his consistent and vocal advocacy of the mass murder of Jews in Europe, Egypt, and Palestine during the war. This is a red thread throughout the book. And I think so because this question throws the longest shadow. In some ways, it is with us even today. Jeff provides a most revealing discussion of what British, French, and US agencies knew of the Mufti's wartime record, and thus how much of the Mufti's activities they deliberately ignored, despite translated and printed documents, all in the name of cultivating good relations with the broader Arab world from Algeria to Saudi Arabia. Indeed, one of the more fascinating aspects of Jeff's book is the use of French records to explain the Mufti's escape from his benign house arrest in Paris to Cairo in May 1946 with the aid of the Quai d'Orsay even as the French Interior Ministry aided Jewish emigration from French ports to Palestine, which is another fascinating aspect of this book that I lack time to discuss. But back to the Mufti. The Western powers, by doing this, thus gave imprimatur, not to Jewish self-determination in the wake of the Holocaust, but to an uncompromising Arab rejectionism that they thought might better serve their geopolitical interest. This was the alternative, one would think, to the much harder job of cultivating moderate voices in Palestine and elsewhere. I.F. Stone, Jeffrey quotes him, called The Mufti's Escape a new rich chapter in the annals of appeasement. And for Jeff, the costs of this decision were catastrophic. And I'll quote Jeff here. The absence of a trial and punishment enabled the leading voice of Arab extremism and radical anti-Semitism to be welcomed home to the Middle East as a hero of an anti-imperialist struggle rather than as a disgraced collaborator with Nazism. I'll close with this. Israel's moment, and I don't have the advantage of talking about the life of the book, because it just came out in 2022. But Israel's moment to me shows remarkable versatility by a master historian. Jeff began his career, as Richard said, writing about the German take on modern technology. He moved to Holocaust memory in divided Germany, then moved to the power and reach of Nazi anti-Semitism, and then to the Cold War politics of the Middle East. He is as much at home with diplomatic and intelligence records and military analyses as he is with great critical theorists such as Max Horkheimer and Theodor Adorno. But he is also moved by a moral compass and the search for truth, the real truth, as it is preserved in the documents. Israel's moment, I have noticed, is doing quite well in terms of reviews. And I am sure that it will stand not only with Jeff's other work on Germany, but with the very best work on the history of Israel as well.
Well, once again, thank you, Norman, very, very much. You understood and explicated the core arguments of the book so very, very well. And if people on the call have not read Israel's moment, then I certainly hope they will, and your discussion of it it gives them a very good sense of what it's about, what you said about the revelations and then the miscalculations and the discussion of Husseini are all spot on. That was very much on my mind as I wrote the book. I think there's a connection between Israel's moment and divided memory regarding Husseini, that in divided memory, I think Norbert Frey is still on the call. I could have written a little more critically about West Germany than I did in divided memory, but I wrote pretty critically about West Germany, and I understood the pressures of the Cold War in West Germany and in the United States to, put the Nazi crimes in the past and focus on the sins of the communists, and that's a theme that almost all of us historians who work on post-war German history have written about, and that process of premature integration and amnesty that Norbert described so very well in Adenauer's Germany in the Nazi past. The German was Vergangenheitspolitik. That's what I had in mind as I was writing about Husseini. That and Matthias too, in his work, brought the history of the era of avoidance in Europe, and he applied that to the case of Husseini, I wish Tony Judd was alive with us for many reasons. Tony, and I disagreed very, very vigorously about Israel, and I regret what he had to say. But he also understood, as a French historian, the myths of 1945, 49, 50, and I think he would have enjoyed Israel's moment. But the point is that the non-trial, the absence of indictment, the absence of a trial, the absence of bringing this guy to account, had very, very severe political implications. And the aftermath of Nazism, its presence in the Arab Higher Committee, the racism of Husseini and his relative Jamal Husseini, that has not been a major factor other than among some Israeli historians, and it certainly should be. In other words, the revival of Husseini's career should be understood as a chapter in the early history of the Cold War in Western Europe and in American policy, whereas liberals have focused on this issue when it comes to the era of avoidance in West Germany and Western Europe. That has not been the Palestinian leadership of the late 1940s has gotten a free pass from too many historians. And so you got that. Let me say, and just very briefly, because I would imagine other people have things they want to ask or comment on, that Norman Goda is one of Gerhard Weinberg's most important students and has emerged as, in my view, one of the most important historians of German and Jewish history in the world. And his textbook on the international dimensions of the Holocaust is really not just a textbook. It's an original interpretation that incorporates the events of the Holocaust into international diplomatic and military history that in ways that I had not anticipated. And it's very, very much worth reading. His work on James MacDonald, the editorial work is detailed and important. And now he's writing a history of the Klaus Barbie trial. Speaking of trials that didn't take place, this is a trial that did take place. And those of you who have read some of Norman's work know what I'm talking about, but those of you who have not have a great pleasure in store, because he is a master historian in the archives and combines it with a kind of clarity and cutting to the core of issues that is really welcome. And as you did in your discussion of Israel's moment. When I wrote The Jewish Enemy, when I began working on The Jewish Enemy, I was at the Rabin Center in Tel Aviv, and I asked myself, that book began as a book about West German anti-communism in the 1940s and in the 1950s, and the extent to which Nazism persisted. And I thought, well, if I'm going to write about this, I should read some Hitler and Goebbels, because and when I did, this was in 2000. I said, wow, there are parts of Hitler and Goebbels that I didn't quite grasp before. And there are a lot of fantastic books about this, but there may be something new to say about this. And Susanna got that in her comments on The Jewish Enemy. And I had the same feeling when I was reading the State Department files, or Kirchway or Seller or Wagner or Stone, that this whole history of the political landscape in the 1940s was sort of known, but hasn't really been well understood, especially by younger generations, but even our own. So it really was, Israel's moment was for me as well a set of revelations and discoveries, and you got them, and you understood them very well. So thank you very much.
Please join me in thanking all four of our speakers, and I will now invite our friends from the rest of the Zoom room to raise your hands if you have a question for any of the speakers or for Jeffrey, or simply if you'd like to speak up with a comment.
If people want to speak in German, they should also do that.
Absolutely. Would someone like to begin?
Can I try to begin in English? Jeff, Ludger Kühnert from Bonn University. In the autumn of 1984, we are celebrating 40 years of Jeff's academic voice, and I think I have been at the cradle, sort of. In 1984,
It's all your fault, yeah.
Yeah, just a few months ago, Jeff. And I entered the Center for European Studies at Harvard and was surprised. I had come from Germany after doing a PhD with Karl Dietrich Bracher on the world refugee problem as a global problem of political order, 40 years before everybody is aware of this tremendous challenge. And I was working on the universality of human rights at that time. And of course, in Germany, I had been kind of trapped time and again in very heated ideological debates. This was in the midst of the Cold War still, between the left and the right. I wasn't sure whether I should consider myself a moderate or a right-wing person or center-right or whatever, struggling with these kind of terminologies still at the time. I entered this Harvard cozy place and realized, wow, here everybody is left liberal. The divisions and divides, which I was, so much experiencing in Germany, didn't exist. Everybody seemed to be left liberal, except for one person who was just smart, and that was Jeff. That was Jeff. He was the smartest of all, the most fascinating and stimulating, and ever since he became my friend and stayed my teacher. And I thank you for this from the bottom of my heart, Jeff. I had been, as I said, inspired by my own academic mentor, Karl Dietrich Bracher, who in many ways also in an indirect way, even without having studied with him, Jeff, was your mentor.
Yes.
Just this afternoon, I visited Karl Dietrich Bracher's home. His widow turned 95 today, and she sends her best regards. She still remembers vividly your presence at Karl Bracher's 90th birthday and your impressive obituary about his powerful contribution to help us understanding. And I think that is what really, brings us, the three of us and many others together, help us understanding the complexity of the totalitarian scourge. And on that account, I think our friendship has been based right from the beginning. Of course, you have contributed so much with the clarity, strictness, and the historic analytical historical power of your work. I remember vividly all the many discussions I was experiencing there in the mid-80s at Harvard, including, for instance, also American self-critical discussions about the abandonment of the Jews, a book by David Wyman, which had come out at that time. And I was very impressed, and I learned a lot. I must say, which I cherish and keep truly in my own intellectual DNA to this day. I think, to pick up one point, Jeff, which you mentioned earlier, you helped me becoming, what shall I say, if I dare to say, I would say a liberal Catholic. I'm Roman Catholic, and I have worked in a kibbutz early on in my life for some time, thinking that this is an act of, expressing my guilt, my sympathy with the victims of the Holocaust. But I was also fully aware of what you earlier said, that anti-Semitism is not conceivable without the very existence of Christianity. But you were always noble in also pointing to the, let's say, soft sides of Christianity, to the human dimension of Christianity. I think you are, and I'm very grateful for this part of our friendship, Jeff, a man of differentiation who knows the power of reconciliation, and in Christian terminology, I would say the power of compassion, even with people like myself. Thank you for this. One last term, because I always was inspired by and guided by the very substance of your first work, the famous reactionary modernism. This has become has become a global component, an element which has reached really all corners of the globe. A couple of years ago, I found myself in the middle of a very heated discussion with an Islamist politician in a very elite circle of West African intellectuals. And this guy tried to convince me that Sharia is the path to liberating our minds. And he tried to tell me that, you know, the way he's educating his own children was by combining Sharia with the gadgets of electronic toys and smartphones. And immediately I thought of reactionary modernism. There we have it again. It was not 9/11 alone and radical Arabs, but political Islam, even in sub-Saharan Africa, which we need to understand and can understand and dissect with the help of your categories, with the help of the categories you developed in reactionary modernism. I explained this to this man. Of course, he was not amused, but I think I benefited even in this uncomfortable situation there from your wisdom and your insights so many years back, developed in this German European context. I think this your work transcends time and space. It is a very powerful contribution, because you were proven right even at that moment in my conversation with this Nigerian Islamist. I think, Jeff, your legacy is global in that sense, lasting and truly inspiring, full of wisdom, truth, and honesty, full of the power of the just. Thank you for all your friendship and Sonja's, and I assure you will always be my friend, and I will always remain your student.
Ludger, thank you very, very much. I want to respond very briefly, because there may be other people who want to say something, but I want other people who are listening and with us to know that Ludger Kuhnhardt is an institution builder, as well as a scholar. And the Center for European Integration Studies at the University of Bonn is Ludger Kuhnhardt's co-creation or creation. And the spirit of reconciliation, of friendship, of European integration is not to be taken for granted, especially now as nationalism and populism and nativism return to all of our countries. Do keep the Zentrum für Europäische Integrationsstudien in your mind. Ludger Kuhnhardt is one of those people who has trained several generations of European diplomats and scholars who are doing their best to hold this continent together in friendship and cooperation when there are many others who are trying to do the opposite. So thank you very much.
We invite other comments or questions for Jeffrey, for the panel. Oh, Richard Hertzinger, please. Are you able to unmute? Yes. Oh. Yes.
No. Yeah, hello, Jeff. Thank you very much for the invitation, and also thank you very much for the very kind words you said about me. I have a very, very principal, huge question. I would like to know what you think about this. Where the basis of our friendship and of the essence of our friendship and of our intellectual comradeship, if you will, was, I think, the defense of liberal universal values against their enemies from the left or the right or from whatever side. I wrote a book in 1995 together with Hannes Stein. Was called Endzeitpropheten oder die Offensive der Anti-Westler. And many people were laughing about this and saying, wow, what are they talking about? Offensive of the anti-Westerners. That's, how can they say, the West is ruling the whole world and so on. But now it has become true what we wrote in this book about all kinds of anti-Western ideologies, from Islamism to Russian nationalism and Eurasianism, from the new right to the so-called post-colonial left. And we saw our thesis was that it's no longer the confrontation between left and right, but between pro-Westerners and anti-Westerners. This is the main front line. So this has become true in a nightmarish way. I mean, the conservative revolution was mentioned before, and it's the frightening thing is that the conservative revolution, or the new right that is sees as the continuation of the conservative revolution, has now got a huge power in the back. It's Russia. You know, it's like the communists had the Soviet Union. Now they have Putin's Russia, and this makes them the dimension of this threat much bigger. Like Putin's the world order that Putin wants to put in place of the liberal world order, that very much resembles Carl Schmitt's Großraumordnung mit Interventionsverbot für raumfremde Mächte. So anyway, we have this anti-liberalism, anti-universalism in the nationalist fashion on the one hand, and we have it in the so-called post-colonial identity politics that also says that these universalistic values and in reality are only means of oppression of colonized people. So those who are defending these liberal universalistic values, I'm afraid, are becoming weaker and weaker. What is the future of the West? What is the future, not only as of the liberal democracies, but also of the ideas, of the values? What's your opinion about that? Are you more optimistic or are you more pessimistic?
Well, first of all, thank you, Richard. Before I respond in any detail, I want to bring to the attention of the listeners Richard's website, where Richard was a columnist for Die Zeit, and then for many years for Die Welt. And now his website is called We Hold These Truths, ... If you Google We Hold These Truths, Richard's essays auf Deutsch and in English, there's a Google Translate into English. They are splendid. And in the context of German intellectual life and journalism, Richard Herzinger is the leading voice in my view. There are probably others, but it was certainly one of the leading voices who warned 20 years ago in Germany about the danger that Vladimir Putin posed to Europe, and warned again and again. And you were a lone voice at times, and has been one of the most passionate and eloquent voices in defense of Ukraine and its war of self-defense. So it's and Richard and I go back indeed to the 1980s, and Endzeit-Propheten is indeed very worth listening to. Richard, I think that you and I and Richard Wolin and Matthias Kunzel and others, we lost the intellectual battle over the meaning of language. That we are liberals. That is, we stand in a tradition from Tocqueville and Mill and Aron and the FDR, and we're liberals. But the arguments that we make to our colleagues sound like conservatives, because the arguments that we make in the German context, the attack on the West has everything to do with Nazism. The Nazisms hated, quote, the West. The West was the French Revolution, British liberalism, American multi-ethnicity. That was the West for the Nazis. But in American history departments, and probably not, and in Germany too, the West is now colonialism, racism, etc. And so we need to fight to reshape the linguistic terrain. And I know you have tried to do that for decades, and so have I, to remind people what liberalism is. Leon Wieseltier started the journal Liberties, and that has a limited subscription. But there are grounds for pessimism. I'm very, very worried about the future of the historical profession in general. And I'm very worried about the survival of the teaching of European political and intellectual history in American history departments. So there are grounds for pessimism. I don't know what else to do except to continue to write and to make the case. And I think that since February 24th of 2022, Richard Herzinger's work in Germany, well, I'd ask you, since February 24th, have people said to you, thank you, Richard, you saw things we didn't see, you were right? No. But instead, people say, well, nobody knew, and nobody knew. But of course, there were people who did. And so there are grounds for pessimism. But there's a broad, liberalism is a broad camp. It extends from Ludger Kuhnhardt over to Matthias Kunzel, and it's and many young people don't understand liberalism, or they misconstrue it. But again, I stress in the last 25 years, and Richard was one of those voices in Germany, not the only one, but one of the most important ones, who warned and warned and warned about Putin and what a reactionary Putin was, what a complete cultural and political reactionary he was. But there was too much money to be made, I'm afraid, with the oil and the gas. So that's my answer. It's we need to keep fighting. We have lost significant battles. Ironically, the president of the United States, Biden, is not an intellectual, but he's a liberal. And we don't have in the United States, of course, there are some, I don't want to exaggerate, but but the consistent defense in favor of liberal values is somewhat lacking. But there's also a backlash against illiberalism on the left, and of course against Trumpism and the hard right. So, you know, I want to end on a positive note that I've learned an enormous amount from you. I think George Orwell died so young. If he must be well over 100 years old if he was alive today. But I think that he would read your essays and say, that guy knows, he knows how to do it.
Oh my God.
And I'll see you when I get to Berlin.
Yes, I'm looking forward. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
I just add a personal word. You are a real institution for me. Whenever I wrote about any subject and I think, am I really right, or is it correct? And then I read something from you, which is, although we did not communicate, exactly makes this point, then I'm really relieved. I said, okay, I'm right, because Jeff says that.
Well, Richard, you reveal that you're a human being, and all of us are human beings, and we need each other, and that's none of us are Stakhanovites or Superman or whatever, and however articulate or forceful we may sound when we're in public, we're human beings and we need each other. So I feel the same way about you.
I have a hand from Jose Naharo.
I can. Let me see if I can unmute myself and maybe get some
You're
video.
unmuted. Yes.
Okay. Jeffrey, congratulations again, and thank you so much again for your presence on the UMD campus. You're a soulmate. You're one of those voices that all of us that were raised in rationalism, as I was trained by the Lycée Français in Madrid during the Franco dictatorship, we cherish your thoughts and our colleagues here. And indeed, I share your pessimism in realism. Indeed, we are in a very difficult period. And I can attest from my vantage point as a scholar in Spanish dictatorship, from Spanish 1939 exile, particularly, and in the way in which European politics have gone sour, that even in a country like Spain that supposedly had overcome a long period of dictatorship and fascism, and compared to Germany, for example, where a thoughtful reconstruction and educational strategies were in place, which were not in place in Spain. We are basically at the same vantage point in this backlash. And my question is, to what extent have we failed from our rational point of view of thinking that maybe, conveying the ideas indeed that totalitarianism, that anti-Semitism, that anti-tolerance, that yes, indeed, the fact that reason has been put aside and identity politics have come to the forefront, that we have not been able to actually give, as you said, the young people that are coming behind us to understand that these may be useful tools in order to put some kind of wall which will not make us repeat, some of the terrible things from the past?
Well, I don't know what I think that what people of our generation learned, and perhaps what I learned as a and Jose, I don't know what you were doing when you were 21, but I was running around. What?
Revolution. I was hoping.
Yes. I was denouncing imperialism and what I think we saw when we were young and we looked at ourselves in the mirror was that we were capable of fanaticism. And that was frightening to me. And then when one studies fascism and Nazism and communism, you see that a lot of other people were capable of fanaticism, and that Freud was right, that the veneer of civilization is thin. So the kind of liberalism that Isaiah Berlin or Raymond Aron or Daniel Bell or was a very different liberalism than the sunny optimism of Franklin Roosevelt. Probably if he had lived into the 40s and after the war, he would might have taken a different view than Happy Days Are Here Again. But my liberalism is a haunted liberalism with a deep appreciation of how appealing totalitarianism has been to many people, and how much of a burden it is to think for yourself, and how much fun it is to be part of a vast collective, what else can we do as scholars but remind people of what happened the last time these kind of ideas were successful? I hope that there's I don't know the intellectual scene in Spain today, so I wouldn't presume to speak about it. But I noticed that the Spanish government, at any rate, has been very supportive of Ukraine. And that the brutality of the war in Ukraine, may have caused a lot of people to rethink various things. The danger of fascism in the United States is not past. I think it's a reality. I don't think it's impossible. So we liberals find ourselves in a situation of criticizing illiberalism from the left and the right at the same time. As a political matter, in the big world outside the university, obviously the right is vastly more of a threat. But in our world of the seminars and the lectures and the universities, I don't know what your experience in College Park has been, but when we were young, we were fighting the administration of the universities, and now sometimes it's the administration that is trying to reduce our autonomy, and so it's important for us to push back against them as well.
Richard?
Just a quick comment on the state of contemporary liberalism. I'm not in the least bit embarrassed or shy about calling myself a liberal or a Democrat, certainly, in this day and age. But I will only say that as long as liberalism, it's the elephant in the room, or one of the elephants, the room is getting small and the elephants are getting larger. As long as liberalism neglects the social question, there are going to be defectors in the direction of identity politics and authoritarianism. So it's a problem that liberalism has to solve. It pretended that by wearing blinders, everything would work out. Where have we seen this before? I mean, the current situation is so reminiscent in so many ways of the 1920s. and the defectors from liberal democracy in the direction of ethno-populism and ethno-authoritarianism. So we need liberalism to undergo some self-reflection and more importantly, institutional changes. Otherwise, the confidence is going to be sapped, and we'll just be speaking to deaf ears. No one will believe those who espouse liberal principles when the end result is social chaos and impoverishment. There has to be some kind of humane social liberalism that reproduces confidence that liberal values can lead to equality and decency and humanity.
Piotr, do you want to have other people respond to what Richard had to say, or do you want to respond, or if we were all in the room together, we would have a lively discussion going on amongst all
we
of us.
would. I mean, we only have 2 minutes left, and it's true. I would love to I'll take 30 seconds because I haven't really said anything yet, although I mean I could wax on and on about walking in Tel Aviv with Jeff and the many wonderful dinners that at Jeff and Sonia's house, and also about just the influence that Jeff had on my book, Catholics on the Barricades, which, I mean, without our conversations, the introduction of that book would be completely different on radicalization, de-radicalization of the intellectuals in mid-20th century. But I would just say one thing, Jeff, you made the point in response to Jose that the Spanish government is supportive of the war in Ukraine, at least. I worry that it is nowhere close to a sufficient condition. I look, for example, at the state of liberal democracy and liberalism in Poland, which to me, the war in Ukraine can become, and support for the war in Ukraine, a bit of a fig leaf, frankly, for covering illiberal tendencies that are playing themselves out more and more dramatically at the national and subnational levels, and especially across Central and Eastern Europe. I see this. I mean, not everybody has to be as open about it as Orban. But it is quite a problematic and pervasive tendency, unfortunately. So I am a pessimist too, certainly at the moment.
And I just respond briefly to what Richard said. I think the challenge in the United States is to extend the principles of social liberalism and the arguments about inequality in a multi-ethnic society. I think in where a society is, quote, ethnically or religiously or homogeneous, the welfare states are larger, the distribution is more extensive. When you have, as in the United States, a multi-ethnic, multiracial society, that's when it gets more difficult. That's when the forces arrayed against equality and even equality of opportunity become more intense. But of course, I agree with the spirit of Richard's comment as well. And Catholics on the Barricades is a superb first book, and I hope other people will pay attention to it.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Jeff. I'm sorry, it falls to me to call our session to a close. I wanted to thank everyone who spoke. I mean, there's such wonderful and rich exchanges. I'm so glad, Jeff, that you spoke individually also with each speaker and each guest. I think that really meant something to all of us. So let me thank again Richard Wolin, Susanna Heschel, Matthias Künzel, Norman Goda, and of course, our honored friend, Jeffrey Herf, for remarks and for this really spirited session. And congratulations, Jeffrey.
Thank you. Thank you, Piotr. Thank you for everybody for listening, for commenting. It's beyond a good day. It really, it's wonderful. I'm very, very grateful. Thank you. Thank you.
Everyone have a good afternoon, a good evening.
Jeff, and our love to Sonia.
Yeah, we will do. We'll do. We'll do.
Be well all.